a well-managed and directed safety ministry uses that emergency response plan as the core of their training program, and their safety team learns what's in it.
Welcome to CV Ministries Church Security Through Prevention podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Blevins. I'm really excited to bring this podcast to you today. My guest today is Paul Lake. Paul has an extensive background in a lot of different areas, but what I think is most impressive is the heart for service that he has for the safety ministry in our churches. There are very few safety and security leaders around the country that I would consider to be a standard for others to glean from, but after talking to Paul today, he is definitely among those leaders. I hope this two-part conversation will help you get going in developing an emergency action plan for your house of worship, or dust off and update the one that you already have. As usual, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast, as well as do a Google review for us. We always appreciate that. So let's get going and spend some time with Paul talking about emergency action plans. Paul, welcome to the Church Security Through Prevention podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I know we haven't officially met until today, so but that's all right. I like getting a lot of different people and a lot of different expertise. So you were actually recommended by a listener of the podcast to reach out to you, and I'm glad we did, because the topic that you're going to discuss today, that we're going to talk about, is emergency action plans. You know, the who needs them, what's in them, what does it say, how do you activate it, and so on. I mean, this is something that if a church has one, you know, like you mentioned a minute ago offline, was that more than likely it's, you know, sitting on a shelf collecting dust. It hasn't really been reviewed on that. And in all honesty, this is a topic that is just too important not to cover for churches to have in place. So let's talk a little bit about emergency action plans.
All right. I think it's important to kind of establish just how critical having an emergency action plan or emergency response plan. Those terms are thrown around synonymous. I use them interchangeably myself. And so, as you mentioned, I think that what I see as I teach across the country more often than not is that churches don't have one at all. And it's my belief that whether you have a church safety ministry or team in place or not, you need to have an emergency response plan, emergency action plan. And then once you have a team developed, that this emergency action plan should be the core of what that team learns about their job. And the reason that I say that and that its importance is, let's just take an event, whatever the thing is that happened at your church that created a problem. Maybe it was a lost child. Let's just say it was a lost child that got away from the daycare area and ended up in traffic and got injured. And you're now part of the church staff, or maybe even the lead on the safety team that's sitting on the stand 6 months or 12 months down the road, and the attorney for the plaintiff ask you this question: does your church have an emergency response plan that specifies what you're supposed to do when this kind of thing happens? And your answer is no. That's a bad thing, right? And so that alone should be motivation enough, but I would purport to you that there's actually an answer that's even worse than that. And that is, yes, we do. And the attorney would then say, oh, as a matter of fact, I know you do, and I have a copy of it here. And let me flip over to page 32, where it says when a child disappears and is unaccounted for, these are the things that you're supposed to do. But guess what? You guys didn't do any of those things. And so what makes that an even worse response is you've now proven to the court system that you thought about it, you felt like it was an important thing, and you put a plan in place, but then you didn't train your people to it, and they didn't do it like it was supposed to be done. So clearly the culpability becomes even more in that case. So having a step-by-step process of what to do when the thing happens, whatever the thing is, that's what an emergency action plan basically covers, is pretty important.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a great point right from the beginning that a lot of churches, a lot of people don't think about. We talk about from time to time on the podcast is you really have to consider that the legal aspect of things when you're looking at a variety of aspects of training, because in the court systems they're going to use everything and anything, and because there's precedent in most cases, then yeah, you just brought up a great point in that's what has to be considered, and that's what we have to look at as we develop these, and not just develop them but utilize them.
Well, when I teach a basic class, I start up front pretty close to the beginning with that concept where I talk about the fact that there's a lot of biblical and moral obligations for us to have a safety program of some type. And I like to refer to it as a safety ministry. And I don't typically go through all the different scriptures in the Bible that substantiate that. Most people know what they are and can easily figure that out. And clearly there's a moral obligation as well. But then that legal aspect that I just mentioned is the one that often will get senior leadership to pay attention to, even if they're not convinced by the other principles that I mentioned. And the legal language says something along the lines, if there is something out there that you should have known about and you didn't do anything to mitigate it, then expect to be held responsible for it.
Right.
And I didn't do that justice because I can't recall the exact legal language, but I think the point's well made, and that then you have to ask yourself, well, what is it that could happen in my church that I could claim I had no clue would ever happen? And I kind of jokingly respond, short of an alien aircraft landing on the lawn and abducting somebody, I can't think of anything that hasn't already been in the news so often that might happen on your church campus that you could claim, I had no prior knowledge that would ever occur, so I didn't plan for it. And so with that fact understood, then that just puts the burden of prep back on the church, where it's actually always been anyway. Right.
Yeah, and this is really gets to the heart with a lot of churches that say, well, we don't we don't need a safety team or a safety ministry or anything like that, and for whatever excuses, and we've talked about a lot of different excuses over the years, and I'm sure you hear them too, and I think it's important that we in the scriptural aspect of it too, to show, well, no, there is precedent, and there is there is biblical principle for what we're doing, not just the legal aspect. But I often tell churches, even in our seminars, you will lose your church in a civil lawsuit, depending on the situation, because ignorance is not something that we can claim anymore in this.
No, that's absolutely true, and it's sad. As a matter of fact, I often talk about the fact that it's actually sad that somebody like myself can make a living traveling across the country teaching churches how to stay safe in today's culture. But it's true, and it started off for me as a ministry many years ago, and then it got to be such a demand that it had to become a business, and I did it on the side as a business for a number of years, and then it got to be such demand I had to leave corporate world to do it full time. And so the need is really there for people to grasp this concept that we don't need no stinking church safety team, is just stinking thinking. And that's kind of crude way of putting it, but it really is. There's all sorts of rationale, biblical, moral, and legal, that churches need to be involved in a safety ministry of some kind. And I actually believe that the safety team needs to be the tip of the spear of your ministry and outreach in your church. And so they are the ones who have to take what's in this emergency response plan and learn it, because if you build the plan and put it on the shelf, and you refer back to that first illustration that we talked about, it not only doesn't do you any good, it actually can do you more harm in the long run. And typically, staff is not going to pay much attention to that. They may pay attention to their policies, but an emergency response plan usually ends up maybe being looked at once when it's first developed, and then it's put on the shelf and rarely looked at again. But a well managed and directed safety ministry uses that emergency response plan as the core of their training program, and their safety team learns what's in it and then operates by it.
Right. Yeah, and something that we talk about in our seminars is the total team concept. Safety isn't just the tip of the spear. Like you said, yep, the safety guys are the tip of the spear. But in order for our churches to be the safe environment for people to come and worship the hurt and the broken, you're also talking your ushers, your greeters, your children's workers, and the staff. That within that, I would think within that response plan that you have to, there's going to be aspects of that to where I also encourage, at least twice a year, you need to be training with these different ministries. And you're right, having that response plan as your foundation that you're training off of is key in that. But you have so many turnovers of volunteers and staff or whatever the case is, depending on the church, everybody's got to be on board. If something were to happen, what is their responsibility and how do they need to respond?
Well, I totally agree with that. As a matter of fact, when I go to a church, especially somewhere in another city, my recommendation is that church do two things. One is that they invite all of those people you just listed, staff, volunteers, especially ushers and greeters, to attend this basic class so they have a good understanding of what the safety team is going through and what they're going to be doing and their goals and objectives. Whether any of those other people ever want to be a safety officer when they grow up or not, it doesn't really matter. They need to know what the safety team is all about, what that ministry looks like, and what their jobs are. And then they also become the extra eyes and ears for the safety team, and they're better prepared to help respond in any kind of emergency situation. And there may be even occasions where you can get your congregation involved in a training. If you get your team up and running and you get your team training on a regular basis and they can incorporate some of the congregation in that training from time to time, then great. You've seated your congregation back with a few more members that know what to do when the thing happens. And that's always a good thing.
Yep, absolutely. So we have the why. We need to have it. So what are some of the things that need to be in a response or safety response plan, emergency response plan? We just want to take a quick break here to let you know how to contact us and where to find out more about our national seminar. I see communities that may know why church security is important, but they may not be doing anything about it or don't know how to do it well. Our national seminars are for ushers, greeters, children's workers, staff, volunteers, your security teams, and other ministries in your community. We say that this is a level 1 training that is designed to help equip you to serve well in your various ministries while maintaining a safe place for people to come. Getting churches on the same or similar page when it comes to security will only make the community safer as well. The easiest way to find out more information or to contact us is to go to cv-ministries.com. There you'll find a variety of training DVDs and books with more being developed all the time. There's also a place at the bottom of the page where you can sign up for our monthly newsletter and to be able to get more information. We would love your feedback on topics or guests that you would like to hear on future podcasts. Okay, now that we have that out of the way, let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, well, I try to help churches understand the concept of a safety ministry, and this is going to lead us into the answer to your question, I think, by using the yardstick as an illustration. And a yardstick has 36 inches, and if you use that yardstick as the safety program, out of that 36 inches, only about 1 inch maybe would be security related items, things that are going to be threat activated, related to what is likely to happen at your church, any particular church, for instance. The other 35 inches of that yardstick are going to be the things that not if, but when happen: the heart attack, the lost child, the asthma attack, the custody dispute, severe weather. Um, but what I see more commonly than not, especially after the highly publicized active shooter situations in churches, is the pendulum swings towards active shooter training. And in reality, out of that 1 inch that might be security related of things that potentially happen at any individual church, less than 1/8 of that 1 inch would be the risk factor for your church on an active shooter. And so your emergency response plan needs to cover all of that, and not just have your local law enforcement come out and teach your church active shooter training, shut the door and say, we're done. Anybody with a CHL or license to carry, come on down and be a part of the church safety team, and we're good to go because we've got active shooter training. That's putting it politely, that's ridiculous. But
Right.
in reality, your emergency response plan, as I mentioned early on, needs to be in place where even if you don't have a team. So should be a document somewhere that people on the ground are familiar with that says, when we have a fire on the campus, these are the steps to be taken. When we have severe weather that threatens the structural integrity of the building, these are the steps that need to be taken. And when we have a lost child, and on down the list, there's all of these different things that are easily identified that you need to address, and need to put it in simple, easy to learn, practical format, so that people not only can learn it first, but remember it in the long haul. And so, I mean, we can go through that list of things that I have in a typical emergency response plan if you want. But that's the gist of what should be an emergency response plan.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is because it's going to be a lot of it. I would say the large chunk of it would probably be similar for virtually any church in America.
Right.
But then you also have to brainstorm what is unique to our church. I mean, this kind of came up. I was doing a seminar out in Ohio, and where they deal with severe weather. Tornadoes and such, where here in Colorado, it just wasn't even on my mind at the time. And somebody brought it up. It was like, you're absolutely right. I need to take better consideration or think about that a little bit, for where I'm at in the country, because, there's different aspects of preparation that different churches are going to have to do. And from what you can, I would love for you to go through what needs to be in it, or what, some of that, because I think that would be helpful for a lot of people to kind of get that idea, to get those juices kind of flowing on their own brainstorming. But I think that's really what it is. Sit down and brainstorm within your own church and say, what is it with where we're at in the city is a factor. Are we out in the country? Are we in the city? There's different things that they're going to have to deal with in those. But just to give everybody a little bit of an idea of what does that look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And to help kind of drive home one of the points you just made, it's not just regional specificity, but it may be programmatic as well, depending on what you do in your church that might be different from other churches. And our church has a special needs ministry, and I don't find that in a lot of other churches. And it's primarily targeted at children with physical or emotional or mental disabilities. And so as a result of that, we have had an incident occur where we have a really large indoor playground area, and it has 2 exits that are into the parking lot from within that large room. And those are both alarmed with emergency exit alarms. But one of those batteries on that emergency exit alarm died, and our roaming officer that is dedicated to checking that every day prior to service start missed it that day. And sure enough, a child got in there, got away from the teacher's view, got out the door, the alarm didn't go, and the child was found playing in the median of the major highway in front of our church.
Wow.
Now, the good news is that didn't result in any injury, but it was extremely scary. And it just drove home the fact that we have a policy and an emergency plan. We had a procedure in place, and it still didn't work that particular day. And we would have been culpable for that had that occurred, had there been an injury involved in that. So specifics about how to deal with that particular ministry in our church would be unique probably to our church, as well as some of the other things that we'll talk about here in a second. So I have a church safety starter kit that I started, 20 plus years ago for my own benefit primarily. I started my team and couldn't find anything out there. And within it, I have an emergency response plan or emergency action plan document that goes through all of this stuff. And it's in a Word format, so you can just kind of fill in for your church. And it's pretty beneficial. And it starts off with just introduction and terminology that's common to the church. And when I teach, that's a pretty important concept to get across to people. And ironically, the reason for that is if you're talking to somebody in an emergency situation and you're trying to direct them from point A to point B, and you know exactly where you are, but your description of where you are doesn't match what the other person understands, then they're still not going to get to you. And that's same with directing inbound EMS or other emergency services to your church. So figuring out what your common terminology, not just for people and positions, but actual geography of the church itself and the campus in general, that needs to be in your emergency response plan. And as you train to it, everybody needs to know what that is and use that common terminology. You need to identify your management hierarchy for the church. That needs to be in the emergency response plan. Actually, I have exhibits that list not only safety team members and their emergency contact information, but your staff and their emergency contact information. You need to have guidelines in there that cover all these different things that we kind of touched on a while ago, like fire, severe weather, drill down on severe weather, between the difference between tornado and a severe storm with lightning and hail, that kind of stuff. It needs to define what's the difference between a tornado watch and a tornado warning, that kind of thing, especially here in Texas and anywhere in Oklahoma, the southern part of the country. Tornadoes are extremely frequent and are very devastating. And I still, to this day, find people confused on the difference between tornado watch and a tornado warning. So you need to talk about winter storms. I'm sure there in Colorado where you guys are, that's a pretty serious issue. How do you deal with that? How do you make the campus safe when there is a winter storm? You need to talk about utility outages. How do you deal with a utility outage? There needs to be an exhibit within your emergency response plan that lists your utility contacts for gas, power, water, all those different things. The emergency contact information for that in case something happens and you need to be able to reach out to those people. What to do in the case of a gas leak, medical emergencies. There's in ours and in our training plan as well, there's a whole section. We have a pretty detailed package of information about that, but regardless of how detailed yours is, you need to be able to address how are you going to respond when someone has a heart attack or asthma attack or any other medical related emergency that will likely happen, all the way from how you activate your in-house medical people to how you activate your outside EMS, and recognizing the time gap between the ability for each of those to respond to the situation. Then you need to talk about security. You need to talk about the organization of your team and how that's put together. You need to identify the positions of the safety team and their job descriptions. And you need to address all the security related issues, like what's your policy on disrupting a service? Here in the state of Texas, it's actually against the law for someone to disrupt a public service. And so how are you going to handle that? How are you going to handle it video friendly, for instance?
Right.
Those kind of things.
Thank you so much for taking time to listen to this podcast. If you really enjoyed it and you found it of benefit to you, we really appreciate your feedback. There's several different ways that you can provide us feedback. One of them is to subscribe to the podcast, is to share it with others, and another is to contact us directly, particularly if you have any questions or concerns, or you want more information on how to host a seminar in your community. You can contact me directly at danielblevins@cv@heart.com, or you can go to our website, that's cv-ministries.com. Both of those will get you in the right direction. Until next time, make sure that you're out there protecting the flock with a heart of service.